I called my son during a medical emergency and his wife said, "Don't bother us," so I took my life back. My name is Margaret Ellison. And on the day everything changed, my chest tightened with a sharp stabbing pain that made me clutch the edge of the kitchen counter. I thought it might be the end. My instinct was to reach for the phone to call the one person who should have come running my son. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. The kitchen light flickered above me as I slid down to the floor, my breath shallow. I fumbled for my phone with trembling fingers. I didn't think about calling an ambulance or a neighbor, I thought only of my son Daniel. For so long he had been my anchor, my reason for pressing forward after my husband died. Surely he would pick up. The line clicked and my heart leapt with fragile hope. But instead of Daniel's voice, it was hers, Rachel, his wife. "Hello." Her tone was clipped, already annoyed. "Rachel, it's me, Margaret. I think I'm having some kind of attack. Please, can you put Daniel on?" There was a pause. Not the kind of pause where someone is shocked into action, but the cold, dismissive pause of someone who doesn't care. Then she spoke, her voice like ice. "Don't bother us. We're busy." Click. The line went dead. For a moment, I stared at the phone screen, willing it to light up with a callback, an explanation, some shred of humanity. Nothing came. I was left on the floor of my kitchen, clutching my chest, realizing that my son, the boy I had raised through sickness and struggle, was somewhere in the same city and yet utterly unreachable. I don't remember how long I sat there. The pain eventually eased enough for me to crawl to a chair. My vision blurred with tears, not just from the physical pain, but from the knife that had been driven into my heart by Rachel's words. "Don't bother us," as if my life, my emergency, was an inconvenience in their carefully curated world. I had always known Rachel didn't like me. She saw me as old-fashioned, perhaps too present in Daniel's life. But I never imagined that dislike could manifest in such cruelty. That she could deny me help in a moment when my life might have hung in the balance. What haunted me most, though, was the silence on Daniel's end. He hadn't even called me back. I tried to rationalize it at first. Maybe Rachel hadn't told him. Maybe he was truly busy with work and didn't know. But even as I sat there clutching a glass of water to steady my shaking hands, a bitter truth settled in my chest. If Daniel wanted to know if he truly cared, he would have called. My mind drifted back to all the times I had been there for him. Nights spent grading papers as a school teacher while also sewing costumes for his school plays. The extra tutoring sessions I paid for even when money was tight. The birthday cakes I baked from scratch because he once told me store-bought ones didn't taste like love. And now here I was, a burden, disposable. The clock ticked loudly in the silence of the kitchen. Every second seemed to echo Rachel's words in my head. "Don't bother us." The next morning, I woke with a dull ache in my chest and a heavier ache in my heart. I dialed Daniel again, determined to hear his voice, to give him the benefit of the doubt. He answered, this time his tone casual. "Hi, Mom. What's up?" "Daniel?" My voice cracked. "I tried calling last night. I wasn't well. He cut me off with a sigh, a sound so weary it made me feel like a child begging for attention. "Yeah, Rachel mentioned something. But Mom, you can't always call us for every little thing. We've got our own lives, our own stresses. Every little thing." That's what he called it. My body giving out my plea for help. I pressed my lips together, trying to keep my dignity intact. "I understand," I whispered, though nothing in me truly did. He rushed off the phone after that, promising to check in later. He didn't. That was the moment the seed of change was planted inside me. For so long, I had lived as though my worth depended on their approval, as if my role as mother meant I was obligated to absorb their coldness. But the kitchen floor had shown me the truth. When it mattered most, they weren't there. As I sat by the window that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a strange calmness. A line had been drawn not by me, but by them. And maybe, just Maybe it was time I stepped back across it and reclaimed the pieces of myself I had left behind. But I wasn't ready to give up on Daniel entirely, not yet. I told myself I needed to understand what had happened to peel back the layers of Rachel's hostility and my son's silence. Because beneath the hurt, there was still a mother's love, desperate for an explanation. I just didn't know then how much darker the truth would get, or how close I was to discovering the strength I had buried all my life. That night, I lay awake with the phone on my bedside table, staring at it as though it might suddenly light up. It didn't. I realized then that I had been waiting not just for a call, but for recognition, for validation, for love that might never come. And for the first time in decades, I asked myself, what if I stopped waiting? What if I stopped depending on them at all? It was a terrifying thought, but also a liberating one. The storm had cracked something inside me, but through the crack, a small light was beginning to shine. The next morning, I woke to silence that felt heavier than the weight pressing on my chest. The house was too still. My late husband's chair sat untouched in the corner, the afghan I had knitted for him draped neatly over the arm. His absence echoed alongside the absence of care from the son we had raised together. I moved slowly, my body still unsteady from the previous night. Every step reminded me of the frailty creeping into my bones. I brewed tea through the kettle's whistle grated against the hollow inside me. As the steam curled upward, I realized how deeply I had wanted Daniel's presence, his arms around me, his voice reassuring me that I was safe. But instead, I had only Rachel's cruel dismissal and Daniel's casual indifference. That morning, I didn't just feel sick in body, I felt invisible. I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around the teacup, replaying the words in my head. Don't bother us. I tried to push them away, but the more I did, the deeper they sank. My chest clenched again. Though this time it wasn't medical, it was grief. The kind of grief that made you feel like the world had already moved on without you. The phone lay beside me. I kept staring at it, waiting for it to ring. I imagined Daniel calling, apologizing, saying he'd been distracted. But the screen stayed dark. When I finally worked up the courage, I dialed him again. He answered after 3 rings. "Mom, I can't talk long," he said, his tone clipped. "We're about to head out." "Daniel." I whispered. I wasn't exaggerating last night. I was on the floor. I thought I might die. He was quiet for a beat, then gave a sigh so sharp it cut right through me. "Mom, you can't dramatize everything. You've always been like this, making small problems into big ones. Rachel and I are under a lot of pressure. You can't keep dumping your crises on us." Dumping. That's what my life was to him now, a burden to be dumped. I ended the call before he could say more, my fingers trembling. The tears came hot and fast. I didn't cry often. After my husband's death, I had promised myself I would stay strong, if not for me, then for Daniel. But sitting there listening to the clock tick in the empty house, I broke. I cried not just for last night, but for the years I had given him. The birthdays where I stayed up late wrapping gifts. The nights when I stayed awake through his fevers. The sacrifices, money I set aside for his schooling instead of my own comfort. Every ounce of love I had poured into him, only to be seen now as a nuisance. It felt like the ground beneath me had given way. Later that day, I forced myself to step outside. The autumn air was crisp, sharp against my skin. I walked slowly down the street, clutching my coat tighter. My neighbor, Mrs. Hernandez, waved from her porch. "You okay, Margaret?" she asked. I opened my mouth to say yes, but the truth spilled out instead. I had a health scare last night. I called Daniel, but they didn't come. Her smile faltered. She clucked her tongue and came closer, her hand resting lightly on my arm. "Oh, honey, that's not right." Her kindness nearly undid me. The contrast was too stark. Here was a neighbor not bound to me by blood, showing more care in a moment than my own family. I muttered something about being fine and quickly excused myself, afraid that if I lingered, I would crumble in her presence. Back home, I lowered myself into the armchair by the window. The afternoon sun streamed in, illuminating the dust motes drifting in the air. I watched them swirl and thought of how life used to feel, busy, full of purpose. Now it was just me drifting, waiting for someone to see me, but no one came. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the shadows of tree branches stretching across it like veins. I wondered if something happened again, if the pain came back sharper, who would find me? Would it be days before someone noticed, weeks? The thought chilled me more than the autumn wind sneaking through the cracks of the window. The next morning, I tried to distract myself with chores. I scrubbed the counters, sorted old photographs, even dusted the shelves. But every photograph of Daniel as a child felt like a dagger. His gap-toothed smile, his small hands clutching mine, it was like looking at a ghost. I pressed one photograph to my chest and whispered, "Where did you go, my boy? Where did my Daniel go?" But the boy in the picture couldn't answer. I heated some soup for lunch, but even the smell of it turned my stomach. I wasn't just hungry for food, I was hungry for love, for acknowledgement, and none of that was coming from my own blood. That evening, I sank into the armchair again, exhausted from holding myself together. The television played faintly in the background, some comedy show with canned laughter that felt cruel in contrast to my silence. Then, my body betrayed me again. A sharp wave of dizziness washed over me, and I felt my knees buckle as I tried to stand. I clutched the armrest, heart-racing, panic swelling in my chest. I wanted to call out, but there was no one to hear me. I staggered toward the phone, but before I could dial, the dizziness ebbed. I collapsed into the chair, breathing hard, my body shaking. The realization struck me with brutal clarity: if I truly collapsed, no one would come. The son I had raised would not come. His wife would not allow him to. That night, I finally accepted something I had been resisting. I was utterly alone in their eyes. I stared at the ceiling and whispered into the dark, "I can't live like this. I won't." The words surprised me. They didn't come from weakness. They came from something deeper, something stirring beneath the grief. A small ember of strength I hadn't felt in years. Because if they could abandon me in my hour of need, then maybe it was time I stopped depending on them altogether. In the days that followed, I moved slowly, not only because of my aching body, but because of the heaviness pressing on my spirit. My life had once felt like a constant sacrifice for Daniel. I never counted the cost, never measured the hours or the exhaustion. Back then, it felt like love. Now, with the silence of my phone and the weight of Rachel's words echoing in my mind, those sacrifices felt like coins dropped into a bottomless well, swallowed, forgotten. I sat one afternoon at the kitchen table, spreading out old photographs. The edges were frayed, some colors fading with time, but they carried my life's story in still images. Daniel in his kindergarten uniform grinning as he held my hand. Daniel blowing out candles on a cake I had stayed up half the night to bake. Daniel at his high school graduation, the tassel swinging across his forehead as I clapped until my hands burned. I remembered how he had clung to me the day his father died. He was barely 15, a boy suddenly thrust into the role of manhood before he was ready. I had promised him then that I would be both mother and father, that I would see him through the storm. And I did. I picked up extra teaching hours. I worked late into the evenings. I even turned down opportunities for myself because every spare dollar and every ounce of energy had to go to him. And for what? For a son who now let his wife decide whether I was worth answering. The memories tugged at me with such force that I couldn't sit still. I pulled out the old sewing machine from the closet, the one I used to make his costumes for school plays. I ran my fingers across the worn surface, and it was as though I could still hear his laughter from the days when he'd parade around the living room in something I had stitched with trembling hands. I had given him everything, even parts of myself I could never get back. Yet in the present, I was an afterthought. That Sunday, I decided to go to church. It wasn't habit anymore. I had drifted after my husband's death. but I needed somewhere to sit quietly, somewhere to let the tears fall without judgment. The hymns rang hollow in my ears. My lips moved, but no sound came out. What caught me most wasn't the words, but the sight of families sitting together. Mothers with sons who helped them to their seats, who leaned close to whisper, who wrapped their arms around frail shoulders. I felt the absence of Daniel's presence like a sharp stone lodged in my chest. After the service, an old friend, Patricia, stopped me. "Margaret, you look thin. Are you all right?" I forced a smile. "I'm managing." She offered to come by for tea. I declined, not because I didn't want her company, but because I felt ashamed. Ashamed to admit the truth that my own son had turned his back on me. That evening, as I sat alone once more, the words Rachel had spat at me returned like a curse. "Don't bother us." The phrase clung to me. It grew heavier with every passing day because it wasn't just about one phone call. It was about every moment she had made it clear I was unwelcome. The times she rolled her eyes when I gave Daniel advice, the way she snatched my grandson's hand away from mine at family gatherings as though my touch might poison him. The whispered comments I wasn't supposed to hear about me being old-fashioned, clingy, too involved. I had brushed them off before telling myself Daniel loved me regardless. But now I saw them for what they were, bricks she had been laying for years, building a wall between me and my son. And I had let her. One night, unable to sleep, I wandered into the living room and opened the old cedar chest by the window. Inside were the keepsakes of a life spent in devotion, report cards, drawings, even the letter Daniel had written me in college, thanking me for being his rock. I held that letter now, and the ink seemed to blur under my tears. How quickly rocks erode when love is no longer returned. I clutched the paper to my chest, but it gave no comfort. Instead, it burned. Because I realized something painful. I had given Daniel the tools to build his life, but he had used those same tools to close the door on me. The next morning, I decided to call again, not out of need, but out of longing. When he picked up, his voice was distracted. I asked him how he was, and he answered in short bursts, his words clipped. When I tried to tell him about my fainting spell, he sighed again. "Mom, you've got to stop. Rachel says you're just trying to guilt me. We can't drop everything every time you feel a little dizzy." The words slammed into me like a blow. Guilt. Was that what they thought? That my pain, my fear was nothing more than a ploy to drag them back to me? I hung up without answering. My hands shook so badly that I dropped the phone on the table. That day, I didn't eat. I couldn't. The hunger inside me wasn't for food, but for love, and that hunger could not be filled by soup or bread. I sat by the window and watched the children playing outside, their laughter rising like a cruel reminder of the days I had once held Daniel's hand and heard that same sound from his lips. I thought about what it meant to be a mother. Was it to give endlessly even when nothing came back? Or was it to draw a line to protect the small ember of dignity that still flickered inside me? I didn't know the answer. But I did know one thing: something inside me was breaking, and it wasn't just my heart. It was the illusion I had clung to, that Daniel would always see me as the woman who raised him, not the burden Rachel painted me to be. That night, I whispered to the empty room, "I don't know if I can forgive you, Daniel. Not this time." The words hung in the air, trembling, fragile but true. I closed my eyes and thought of all the women like me, mothers who gave, until they had nothing left, only to be pushed aside when they needed care. Women who carried invisible scars from being told they were inconvenient. And I wondered, was this what motherhood always risked becoming? I ask you now, to whoever is listening to my story, have you ever been in a situation like this? If you were in this situation, would you forgive or take revenge? Comment below to let us know. I had always known Rachel wasn't fond of me, but after that night when she dismissed my plea as though my life meant nothing, I began to replay every interaction with her in a new, harsher light. The signs had been there for years. I remembered the first time Daniel brought her home. She had been polite, overly polite, the kind of courtesy that carried a thread of condescension. She smiled at my cooking but pushed her plate away half full. She complimented my house but immediately suggested ways it could be updated. At the time, I brushed it off as nerves. Young women sometimes struggled to fit into the role of daughter-in-law. I told myself patience would soften her edges, but edges only grow sharper when left unchecked. Rachel never missed an opportunity to remind me that I belonged to an older generation. When I spoke of values, she smirked and said, "That's not how things work anymore." When I told stories from my years as a teacher, she tuned out scrolling on her phone. And Daniel, my sweet Daniel, he laughed it off. "She doesn't mean anything by it, Mom," he'd say. But each little dismissal was a stitch unraveling the fabric of our relationship. Over time, her hostility grew bolder. I once offered to babysit their son so they could have a night out. Rachel gave me a tight smile and said, "We don't want him picking up your old-fashioned ways." Her words pierced me like needles. What kind of poison had she planted in Daniel's mind that he let them go unchallenged? Family gatherings became battlegrounds I hadn't even realized I was fighting in. I would bring a dish only for Rachel to announce loudly that she had already prepared something more suitable. I would try to tell my grandson a story, and Rachel would interrupt with a louder, flashier tale. It was as if she needed to erase me to push me into the background until I faded entirely. And Daniel? He nodded along, smiling at her every move, too blind or too weak to defend me. I had ignored these things before telling myself that she was young, that marriage would mature her, that Daniel would one day see the cruelty for what it was. But after that phone call, "Don't bother us," all those memories lined up in a devastating row. This wasn't sudden. It was deliberate. A slow, calculated effort to isolate me. One afternoon, I decided to visit unannounced. I thought perhaps face to face I could speak to Daniel without Rachel's interference. I knocked on their door holding a small gift for my grandson, a book I had chosen carefully. Rachel opened the door. Her eyes narrowed instantly. "Oh, Margaret." The way she said my name flat and clipped told me everything. "Hello, Rachel," I said gently. "Is Daniel home?" She didn't step aside. "He's busy. You should have called first." I hesitated, the gift heavy in my hand. "I just wanted to drop off a book before I could finish." She cut me off. "We don't need surprises. Please call next time." The door closed before I had a chance to protest. I stood there on the porch, the autumn wind whipping around me, clutching that little book as though it were a piece of my heart she had rejected. The humiliation burned so deep it felt like fire under my skin. When Daniel finally called me later, his tone was defensive. "Mom, Rachel said you came by without telling us. You know how busy we are. You can't just drop in." I tried to explain. "Daniel, I only wanted to see you. To see my grandson." But he was already siding with her, his words rehearsed. "You need to respect our boundaries. Things are different now." Boundaries. That word again. Boundaries had become the weapon Rachel wielded to cut me out. I hung up my throat tight. It was no longer a matter of misunderstanding. Rachel wasn't just indifferent, she was hostile. She wanted me gone, erased from Daniel's life. And the worst part was that Daniel was letting her. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed every scene in my mind, every door shut in my face, every time Rachel twisted my love into something inconvenient. I thought of how Daniel used to run into my arms, how his little voice once begged me not to leave his side at night. Where had that boy gone? I had once believed love was stronger than influence, that a mother's bond couldn't be broken. But Rachel was proving me wrong. I whispered into the dark, "She's turning you against me, Daniel. And you don't even see it." The following weekend, my relatives hosted a small get-together. I hadn't planned to go, but something inside me urged me out of the house. Perhaps it was desperation for connection, perhaps a flicker of pride. When I arrived, I could feel the stares, the whispers. Cousin Mary pulled me aside, her voice low. "Margaret, I heard Rachel's been saying things." that you're difficult, that you call at all hours make a fuss about nothing." The words made my stomach churn. So this was how she worked quietly, steadily turning the family against me, while I sat alone in my house unaware. I forced a smile, though my insides trembled. "People will believe what they want," I said softly, but inside a storm raged. Rachel wasn't content just to distance Daniel from me. She wanted to destroy my reputation entirely. That night, back in my quiet house, I sat in front of the mirror and studied the lines on my face. Were they the marks of age or of battle? My reflection looked tired, but beneath the weariness, I saw something else flickering: anger. Not the wild anger of youth, but the slow, simmering anger of someone who had endured too much. Rachel thought she could erase me. Daniel thought he could stand by in silence. But as I stared at myself, I realized something. I was not weak. I had survived widowhood. I had raised a son alone. I had given everything of myself. And if they thought they could discard me, they were wrong. This was no longer just about being hurt. It was about dignity. And I was not ready to let mine be buried. The days after that confrontation with Rachel passed like a fog, heavy and oppressive. I tried to convince myself that Daniel would eventually see through her coldness, that my son, my own flesh and blood, couldn't truly forget what I had meant to him. But with every call, every strained word, I realized just how far away he already was. One morning, I dialed his number again. He answered quickly, but his voice was flat rushed. "Mom, I'm in the middle of something. Can you make it quick?" I hesitated. The words I had rehearsed about missing him, about feeling alone, suddenly sounded pathetic in my mind. "I just wanted to hear your voice," I whispered. He sighed, as though my need for reassurance were some kind of weight dragging him down. "Look, Rachel and I are juggling a lot right now. Work's stressful, the kids got activities every weekend. I can't keep dropping everything whenever you feel lonely. Whenever you feel lonely, as if loneliness were a frivolous hobby I indulged in." "I understand," I said softly. But my voice cracked, betraying me. "I'll try to call you next week," he said, and before I could respond, the line went dead. I sat staring at the silent phone in my hand, numb. Next week. Love once given daily was now rationed out in small, reluctant doses. I thought of how I had once been his center, the one he turned to for comfort. Now I was reduced to an obligation penciled into his schedule, easily erased. I told myself I'd give him space, but space soon turned into absence. He didn't call that week or the one after. When I finally mustered the courage to call again, Rachel answered. Her voice was clipped, efficient. "Daniel's not here." "What do you need?" I swallowed hard. "Just tell him his mother was thinking of him." "Fine," she said. No warmth, no acknowledgement. Just fine. The line went dead again, and the silence that followed was deafening. I tried to hold on to the good memories, but even those began to twist into pain. The way Daniel used to cling to my hand, now I pictured him clinging to Rachel's instead, walking past me without a glance. The way he once asked me to stay by his bedside when storms frightened him, now he shut me out with the same storms raging inside me. At night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and wondered when exactly he had stopped being my son. Was it when Rachel entered his life? Or had the distance been growing quietly while I told myself things were fine? I wasn't sure anymore. The distance became more visible in public, too. At a family cousin's birthday party, Daniel barely acknowledged me. When I tried to hug my grandson, Rachel swooped in with a smile so sharp it could cut glass. "Come on, honey, let's go play outside." She whisked him away before my arms could even close around him. Daniel stood by his smile, polite, but his eyes avoided mine. I sat at the table, surrounded by chatter and laughter, yet completely alone. I could feel the pitying glances from relatives, the whispered questions behind cupped hands. They all knew. They saw how far I'd fallen in my son's eyes. When I left the party early, no one stopped me. Back home, I sank into my chair and let the tears fall freely. They burned my cheeks not only because of the pain, but because of the shame. Shame that I had become so dependent on scraps of love from people who treated me like an afterthought. I asked myself over and over, why? Why did Rachel despise me so much? What had I done to her? I thought of the times I tried to help offering advice when the baby was born, showing her recipes Daniel had loved since childhood. Each time she had brushed me off, her eyes cold, her smile tight. She didn't want a mother-in-law. She wanted control. And Daniel had handed himself to her willingly. I could feel him slipping further away, as though Rachel were pulling him by the hand into a world where I didn't exist. One evening, I tried again to reach out. I called Daniel just to ask if he'd like to come over for dinner, something simple, just the three of us. He hesitated. "I'll check with Rachel," he said, his voice uncertain. Hours later, Rachel herself called back. "We won't make it. Daniel's exhausted, and frankly, you need to stop expecting us to rearrange our schedules for you." I tried to keep my composure. I wasn't asking for much, just a meal together. Her tone sharpened. "Margaret, you need to understand Daniel has his own family now. You can't cling to him forever." The words sliced through me. His own family now. As if I had never been part of it. I hung up before my voice could betray my tears. That night, I sat in front of the mirror again. My reflection looked back at me, tired, worn, but alive, and I whispered to myself, "You are not invisible. You are not nothing." I needed to hear those words because no one else would say them for me. Over the following weeks, I stopped calling as often. Not because I didn't want to hear Daniel's voice, but because each call left me emptier than before. I began to sense a shift in him, a distance that wasn't accidental. His words grew colder, more rehearsed. He was no longer Daniel, my son. He was Daniel, Rachel's husband. And in her shadow, he was unrecognizable. I realized then that I wasn't just losing him, I had already lost him. And the bitter truth settled in my love was no longer enough to pull him back. I stared at the ceiling late into the night, whispering the question that haunted me. When did I become a burden instead of a mother? The holidays came, and with them, family gatherings that once brought me joy. But this year, I noticed something different. My phone stayed silent. No invitations came from Daniel or Rachel. I sat at home, the living room dim, except for the faint glow of the small Christmas tree I had put up alone. I had always been the one to host stringing lights, baking cookies, wrapping gifts with care. Daniel used to help me decorate, his laughter filling the house. Now all I had was silence. At first I told myself they were busy, perhaps traveling. But when I ran into my cousin Mary at the grocery store, she looked surprised. "Margaret," she said, frowning, "I thought you weren't feeling well. Rachel told everyone you weren't up for company this year." The words hit me like ice water. Rachel had spoken for me. She had told them I didn't want to be there. "That's not true," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I never said that." Mary hesitated, pity flickering in her eyes. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. But I knew better. This wasn't misunderstanding, it was manipulation. Rachel was weaving a story about me, and I wasn't even in the room to defend myself. I went home that night and sat by the window staring at the falling snow. The world outside was bright and alive, but inside my house I felt erased. Rachel wanted me gone, not just from Daniel's life, but from the family altogether. By telling others I was too frail, too tired, too unwilling, she painted me as someone fading into irrelevance. And Daniel, he didn't stop her. That realization sat heavy in my chest. A week later, another cousin, Thomas, called me. His tone was hesitant. "Margaret, we missed you at the party. Are you doing all right?" I forced a smile he couldn't see. "I'm fine, Thomas. I just didn't know I was welcome." He was quiet for a moment, then muttered, "Rachel said you've been difficult lately, that you don't want to be around people." I closed my eyes, the humiliation searing. Difficult. That was the word now. Not caring, not loving, not devoted. Difficult. Thomas, I said softly, if anyone asks, tell them I never said that. I would have been there if I'd known. His silence told me he believed me, but the damage was already done. I thought about my role as a teacher, how I used to tell my students that truth always finds a way to surface. But here I was, watching lies spread faster than I could stop them. The loneliness deepened. I stopped checking my phone as often because each time I did it only reminded me of how little anyone wanted me there. I thought about the years I had carried the family gatherings, the way people would crowd my kitchen, praising my food, thanking me for hosting. Rachel had taken all of that and turned it upside down. She had stolen not just my son, but my place in the family. One Sunday, I decided to go to church again just to feel part of something. After the service, an old friend Ellen asked why she hadn't seen me at Daniel's Christmas dinner. The sting was immediate. I wasn't invited, I admitted. Ellen's brow furrowed. That's strange. I thought Rachel said you were resting at home. There it was again, her narrative weaving its way through every conversation, every ear. I smiled faintly, though inside I was crumbling. Yes, that must be it. But as I walked home through the cold air, I felt the truth burn in me. Rachel wasn't just keeping me away. She was erasing me one lie at a time. That evening, I looked around my quiet house. The decorations I had once loved seemed mocking now. The stockings still hung on the mantel untouched. The cookies I had baked sat uneaten in their tin. I asked myself, how did I become the ghost of my own family? In January, another family gathering came and went without me. This time, I didn't hear it from Mary or Thomas, I saw it online. A photograph popped up on social media, Daniel, Rachel, their son, and the rest of the family smiling around a long table. I wasn't there. No one had called, no one had checked in. And in the comments, Rachel had written, "So grateful for family time even though Mom couldn't make it this year." My hands trembled as I stared at the screen. Mom couldn't make it. As though I had chosen to be absent, as though I had abandoned them, not the other way around. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout the truth to anyone who would listen, that I had been excluded, not unwilling. But instead, I closed the laptop, my heart pounding with helpless rage. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something painful but necessary. I was fighting a battle I couldn't win on their terms. Rachel controlled the narrative, Daniel supported her, and the family believed what was easiest. If I stayed silent, I would disappear entirely. But if I fought back, I risked losing Daniel completely. I was trapped in a cruel game, one I had never agreed to play. I whispered into the darkness, "You've taken enough from me, Rachel, but I won't let you take me away from myself." The words felt small, but they were mine, and they were the beginning of something I hadn't felt in years: defiance. I didn't know how I would fight back yet. I didn't know how to reclaim my dignity. But I knew one thing: I was done letting her silence me. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was overcast, the kind of dull gray that seeps into your bones. I had decided to take a short walk to the market a few blocks away. My doctor had told me to keep moving to keep my circulation steady, even when my chest still ached on bad days. I bundled into my coat, pulled a scarf around my neck, and set off slowly down the cracked sidewalks. The cold air stung, but it also cleared my mind, if only for a little while. I told myself I was fine. I told myself I could handle this life of silence from Daniel, of dismissal from Rachel. But sometimes the body reveals truths the mind refuses to admit. Halfway home, as I crossed the street with a small bag of groceries, the dizziness came like a wave. My knees buckled. The bag slipped from my hands, apples rolling across the pavement. My vision blurred, and I felt myself collapsing. This was it, I thought. Not in the quiet of my kitchen, not in the solitude of my living room, but here, in the middle of the street, in full view of strangers. I don't remember hitting the ground, only the sound of voices rising around me. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Someone call 911. Hands lifted me gently, propping me against the curb. A woman crouched in front of me, her eyes full of concern. A man knelt at my side, pressing a water bottle into my shaking hands. "You're going to be all right," the woman soothed. "Just breathe." And in that moment, surrounded by strangers, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: care. Genuine, urgent care. It stung not because of their kindness, but because of the contrast. These people didn't know me. They owed me nothing. Yet here they were, cradling my head, gathering my groceries, calling for help. Meanwhile, my own son, my own family had brushed me aside when I begged for the same. An ambulance came, the paramedics moving swiftly, their voices calm and steady. They asked about my history, my symptoms, my emergency contacts. My lips trembled as I gave them Daniel's name and number. One paramedic dialed while the other checked my pulse. He hung up quickly, glancing at me with hesitation. He didn't answer. "Do you want us to try again later?" I shook my head, tears pooling in my eyes. "No, don't bother." The words escaped before I realized it. Don't bother. The same words Rachel had hurled at me, now bitter on my own tongue. At the hospital, they kept me overnight for observation. A mild cardiac episode, they said, brought on by stress and exhaustion. Stress, I almost laughed when I heard it. Stress had become the air I breathed. A nurse checked on me, often offering small comforts, warm blankets, soft reassurances. And every time she smiled at me, I thought, this stranger shows me more kindness than my own son. I wanted desperately for Daniel to walk through the hospital doors, to sit by my bed like I had once sat by his when he was a sick child. But the hours passed, and he never came. The next morning, the doctor released me with a stern warning. "You need rest, Mrs. Ellison, and less emotional strain. Stress can be just as dangerous as physical illness at your age." I nodded, clutching the papers in my trembling hands. Less emotional strain. If only it were that simple. When I stepped outside, the air felt fresher, sharper. I looked around at the bustling world, the cars rushing by, the people walking briskly to their lives, and I realized I was just another invisible figure in the crowd. But to those strangers yesterday, I hadn't been invisible. I had been someone worth saving. That thought carried me home, and once inside, I lowered myself into the armchair by the window. I looked out at the world, at children skipping down the sidewalk, at neighbors waving to each other, and the anger surged. Why was it that strangers could see me, but Daniel could not? Why was it that people with no blood tie could reach out to help, while my own son let his wife dictate that I was nothing more than a nuisance? I had been humiliated enough. The image of me crumpled in the street, rescued by strangers, haunted me. But it also sparked something else: clarity. Later that week, Daniel finally called. His voice was casual, as if days hadn't passed without a word. "Hey, Mom. Just checking in. How have you been?" I stared at the phone, my chest tightening. Not from illness, but from rage. "I was in the hospital, Daniel," I said flatly. He paused. "What? Why didn't you call?" I almost laughed at the absurdity. "I did. They told me you were too busy." Silence. Then a sharp intake of breath. "Rachel didn't tell me. Of course she didn't. But the damage was done." I collapsed in the street. I continued, my voice trembling. "Strangers picked me up, Daniel. Strangers took care of me. Not you. Not your wife. Strangers." His excuses tumbled out, something about work, about not knowing, about Rachel being overwhelmed. I let him speak, but inside a wall was rising. I realized that whether or not Rachel had passed on my calls, Daniel had chosen not to notice the silence of his own mother. He had chosen not to ask why I had been missing from holidays, why my voice had grown smaller with each passing week. He had chosen not to see me. That night, I lay awake, replaying it all. Rachel's icy words, Daniel's dismissals, the whispers from relatives, the lies that painted me as fragile, difficult, inconvenient. And then the hands of strangers lifting me from the ground, the voices of people I had never met telling me I mattered enough to save. It was a painful truth, but it was also liberating. I couldn't rely on Daniel anymore. He was lost to me, swallowed by Rachel's shadow. If I wanted to survive, if I wanted to live, I had to stop begging for scraps of love from people who didn't see me. I had to start seeing myself again. That decision didn't erase the hurt, but it planted something new inside me. Resolve. I whispered into the night. You may have abandoned me, Daniel, but I will not abandon myself. And for the first time in months, I felt my chest loosen, not from medicine or rest, but from the quiet strength of my own voice. The morning after my hospital stay, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. The steam curled upward, blurring my reflection in the window. For weeks, I had felt like I was dissolving, shrinking into the role Rachel assigned me, fading into the background of Daniel's new life. But something had shifted the day strangers lifted me off the street. If people who didn't even know my name could see me as worthy of saving, then why couldn't I? I wrapped my hands tighter around the cup. The warmth seeped into my fingers, and I made myself a promise I would stop begging for scraps of love. I would no longer sit in silence waiting for a phone call that never came. I would not let Rachel or Daniel decide whether I mattered. I was going to take my life back. It began with small steps. I cleaned the house not out of obligation, but with intention. Each sweep of the broom, each dusted shelf felt like reclaiming space that had grown stale with grief. I opened the curtains wide, letting light pour in. For months, I had kept them half closed as though hiding from the world. Not anymore. Then I pulled out my old journal, the one I hadn't touched in years. I wrote everything: my anger, my loneliness, the memory of lying on that kitchen floor while Rachel dismissed me like trash. My words filled page after page, and with every sentence the tightness in my chest eased. That week, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I went back to the community center. When I walked through those doors, the familiar smell of old books and coffee greeted me. A bulletin board overflowed with flyers for classes painting yoga book clubs. I had once spent years advising parents and tutoring children here. Now I stood as a stranger to a place that used to feel like home. A woman at the desk looked up and smiled. "Can I help you?" For a moment, my throat closed. I had forgotten what it felt like to be addressed with warmth. "I'd like to sign up for something," I said. My voice trembled, but I forced it steady. "Maybe the book club." Her smile widened. "Wonderful. They meet on Thursdays. You'll love the group." I walked away, holding the schedule, my steps lighter than they had been in months. On Thursday, I nearly backed out. The old voice in my head whispered, "You don't belong anywhere. You're too old, too unwanted." But then I remembered the strangers lifting me from the street, reminding me I was still human. I dressed carefully, choosing a blouse I hadn't worn in years, and forced myself out the door. When I arrived, the group welcomed me like an old friend. They pulled out chairs, poured me tea, asked for my opinions. I spoke hesitantly at first, but soon words flowed. We debated characters, laughed over metaphors, shared our own stories between chapters. For the first time in so long, I felt seen. Not as a burden, not as difficult. Just as Margaret. That night when I came home, the silence of the house didn't feel like punishment anymore. It felt like peace. I realized then that Rachel's greatest cruelty wasn't just her words, it was the way she had made me believe them. She had convinced me I was invisible. But in that book club, I had seen proof I wasn't. A few days later, I passed by a mirror and paused. My reflection startled me. For months, I had seen only tiredness lines carved deep by sorrow. But now there was something different in my eyes, a glimmer of defiance. I whispered to my reflection, "You're still here." It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was enough. Daniel called that weekend. His tone was casual, almost guilty. "Hey, Mom. I heard you went to the hospital. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I clenched the phone tighter. I did tell you, Daniel. You just didn't want to hear it. Silence. Then he muttered. Rachel didn't say, "Stop blaming Rachel." I interrupted, my voice firm. You're my son. If you cared, you would have noticed. You would have come. He stammered, caught off guard. I had never spoken to him like that before. I felt the tremor in my hand, but my voice stayed steady. I needed you. You weren't there. That's all there is to it. He started to protest, but I ended the call before he could. My heart raced, but for the first time, it wasn't from fear or sorrow. It was from strength. That night, I pulled out my journal again and wrote in bold letters, "I will no longer beg for love." The words looked foreign on the page, but powerful. A declaration to myself. Over the next few weeks, I kept building small pillars of independence. I joined a walking group at the park. I signed up to teach a short literature class for seniors. I even started cooking new recipes, not because anyone else would eat them, but because I deserved to enjoy them. Each act was like stitching back a piece of myself that had been torn away. I knew Rachel and Daniel would notice the distance eventually. I knew they might not like the new version of me, one that no longer bowed to their neglect. But I no longer cared, because for the first time in years, I wasn't living for their approval. I was living for me. One evening, I sat by the window again, watching the sun set over the neighborhood. Children laughed outside, neighbors waved to one another, life carried on. And instead of feeling like a ghost, I felt like part of it again. I whispered softly, almost like a vow, "I am taking my life back." The words tasted sweet on my tongue. Strength is a curious thing. It doesn't arrive all at once like a thunderclap. It builds slowly, quietly, until one day you realize you are no longer the same person who knelt begging for scraps of love. In the weeks after joining the book club, after teaching that first small class at the community center, I felt a part of myself waking up. Yet one thread remained tangled inside me, Daniel. I told myself I had let go, but a mother's heart is stubborn. It clings even when bruised. And I needed to know, was there anything left of the son I once knew, or had Rachel truly erased me from him forever? So I devised a test. It was a simple plan, really. I told Daniel I needed help, just a small errand. A cabinet in my kitchen had come loose, and I asked if he could come by to fix it. I deliberately downplayed it, making it sound urgent but not catastrophic. A test not of his ability, but of his willingness. "Of course, Mom," he said over the phone. His voice was polite, distant. "I'll see when I can make the time." But days passed. No Daniel, no call, nothing. I let a week go by before reaching out again. Rachel answered this time. "Daniel's busy," she said coolly when I asked. "We can't keep dropping everything for these little inconveniences. Why don't you hire someone? That's what people do." I clenched the phone tighter. Little inconveniences. That's what I was to her. A loose cabinet, a fainting spell, a heart that sometimes raced out of rhythm, all the same an annoyance. I thanked her quietly and hung up. That night, I fixed the cabinet myself. My hands trembled, but with a screwdriver and determination, I managed. And when I stepped back, sweat on my forehead, I whispered to the empty kitchen, I did it. Without them. But the test wasn't over. A week later, I called again, this time pretending I had misplaced some important paperwork, my insurance papers. I told Daniel I was worried that I needed help sorting them. Surely I thought a son would come for something like that. He promised he would, but again, he didn't. Instead, Rachel called back later that evening, her voice laced with irritation. "Margaret, you can't keep pulling Daniel into these things. He has a full-time job. He has a family. You need to stop making him your crutch." Her words hit me like daggers. My crutch. After decades of being his rock, after giving every piece of myself to ensure his future, I was now an old stick to be discarded. I wanted to scream into the phone, to list every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment of love. But instead, I held my tongue. because I realized something. She was revealing herself piece by piece, and Daniel was letting her speak for him. So I designed one last test. This time, I raised the stakes. I told Daniel I had received a letter from the bank about my house, about some confusion in my accounts. I told him I was worried that I might lose everything if I didn't get it sorted. I didn't. It was a lie, but it was one I needed to tell. If anything could bring a son running, surely it would be the fear that his mother was losing her home. When I called, he hesitated. "That sounds serious," he said slowly. "But Rachel and I are tied up this week. Maybe next weekend." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Next weekend?" "Yes," he said, his voice firm now. "It's just, we've got too much going on. Too much going on. To check if his mother was losing her home." I thanked him and hung up, my body trembling, my heart pounding with both rage and clarity. That night, I sat at my desk and pulled out my journal. I wrote every detail, every word, every sigh of dismissal. I wrote about the tests, the excuses, the way my son's love had been reduced to scheduled inconveniences. Then I wrote the truth. They don't care. Not the way they should. Not the way I deserve. It was brutal to admit, but freeing. Because once you accept that someone has abandoned you, you stop standing at the door waiting for them to return. Still, another thought stirred inside me. If Rachel wanted to paint me as frail, as difficult, as invisible, then perhaps it was time I told the family the truth. Not in whispers, not in apologies, but openly. I imagined the looks on their faces when they learned that during my collapse, Rachel had told me, "Don't bother us," that Daniel had chosen silence over action, that strangers had picked me off the street while my son ignored my calls. Would they still believe Rachel's lies then? Would they still nod politely when she smiled and said, "I had chosen to stay home from family gatherings"? Or would they finally see me, see her, see Daniel for what we all truly were? The idea grew in my mind, taking root like a tree. I was tired of being erased, tired of being silenced. If Rachel wanted a war of stories, then I would no longer fight it in silence. I would tell the truth. And when I did, I would watch their carefully crafted image shatter. I looked at myself in the mirror that night, my reflection framed by the soft lamplight. My eyes were not weak anymore. They were sharp, alive. And I whispered to that woman in the glass, "How do you think they will react when I reveal that to everyone?" The question lingered in the room like a promise. After deciding I would no longer be silent, something shifted inside me. It was as if a fog had finally lifted. For months, I had lived in shadows, waiting by the phone, shrinking under Rachel's disdain, aching for Daniel's love. But once I admitted the truth that they would not come to my rescue, I realized I had to become my own. The first step was my health. I scheduled an appointment with my doctor, not out of fear, but out of determination. I wanted answers. I wanted a plan. Sitting in that small exam room, I felt like I was reclaiming ownership of my body. "Mrs. Ellison," my doctor said kindly, "your episode was serious but manageable. Stress is a factor, but so is diet, rest, and exercise. You need to prioritize yourself. No more carrying weight that isn't yours." I nodded, her words striking deeper than she realized. No more carrying weight that isn't mine. For decades, I had carried Daniel's burdens, his needs, his happiness. But what about mine? I walked out of that office with a new prescription and a pamphlet on heart health, but more importantly, with a vow I would not let their neglect kill me. I began small. Morning walks in the park, fresh vegetables from the market, even meditation, something I used to scoff at. I would sit by the window, close my eyes, and let the silence wash over me. At first, the old voices intruded, Rachel's sharp tone, Daniel's sighs of impatience. But slowly those voices quieted, replaced by the sound of my own breathing. With each passing day, I felt stronger. Not cured, not healed, but sturdier. Next, I turned to my finances. For years, I had managed well enough, but quietly, I had feared the day when I might need Daniel's help. That fear had made me cling harder, made me tolerate Rachel's cruelty, as though dependence excused their neglect. No more. I pulled out every bank statement, every document. I spread them across the dining table like puzzle pieces. At first, the numbers overwhelmed me, but then the teacher in me resurfaced, the woman who had once balanced school budgets and planned lessons down to the last detail. I categorized, calculated, reorganized. By the time I finished, I realized something freeing. I was stable. I didn't need Daniel's money. I didn't need Rachel's approval. My security was mine alone. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Emotional strength was harder. Healing the body was one thing, healing the heart was another. But I leaned on the small community I had built, the book club, the walking group, even Patricia from church, who dropped by with fresh bread one afternoon. These women asked me how I was and actually listened. They laughed with me, shared their own burdens, reminded me I wasn't alone in the way Rachel wanted me to believe. One evening after book club, Ellen squeezed my hand and said, "Margaret, you're glowing. It's like you've come back to life." Her words startled me. Had I truly looked so lifeless before? But she was right. For the first time in years, I wasn't defined by what I lacked. I was defined by what I still had. Daniel noticed the distance eventually. He called one night, his voice tentative. "Mom, I feel like you've been distant. Is everything okay?" I almost laughed at the irony. "Yes, Daniel. Everything is fine. I've just been busy." "Busy," he repeated as though the word confused him. "Yes," I said firmly. "I joined a book club. I'm teaching again. I've been taking care of myself." The silence on the other end was telling. For years, my life had revolved around him, every phone call a lifeline, every invitation a desperate attempt to be included. Now I no longer needed to beg. He cleared his throat. "That's good, Mom. I'm glad." But I could hear the uncertainty, the discomfort. For the first time, he was realizing I wasn't waiting by the phone anymore. It wasn't revenge yet, that would come later, but it was the first taste of freedom, and it was intoxicating. I began to walk taller even when no one was watching. I started wearing clothes I had tucked away, the blouses and scarves I once thought were too much for a woman my age. Why not? I was still alive. I was still here. One morning, as I stood in front of the mirror adjusting a silk scarf, I whispered, "You've survived worse, Margaret. You will not be erased." Rachel, of course, noticed the change. At the next family gathering I finally attended, she raised an eyebrow when I walked in head high, dressed with care. "Well," she said with a smile too sweet to be sincere, "you look different." "Yes," I replied evenly. "I suppose I do." For once I didn't shrink under her gaze. I didn't let her tone slice me open. I stood tall, shook hands with relatives, told stories with laughter in my voice. I saw the confusion in her eyes, confusion that her campaign to diminish me had failed. And I saw something else too. Fear. That night, back home, I sat at my desk and wrote again in my journal, "Health rebuilding, finances secure, heart mending." Then I wrote the words that had been simmering in me for weeks, "I am ready." Because this wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about reclaiming every piece of dignity Rachel had tried to strip away. And soon, very soon, the truth would come out. I closed the journal and whispered into the silence, "You thought I was weak, but you were wrong." And for the first time in years, I believed it. Taking back my health and my independence was the foundation, but what I needed next was life. Real life. Not the hollow waiting, not the quiet grieving for a son who had chosen someone else's narrative over mine. I wanted to live again, not just exist. So I began reaching outward. It started with a call to an old colleague, Susan, from my teaching days. We hadn't spoken in years, but I dialed her number anyway, unsure if she'd even remember me. Her voice lit up with warmth the moment she answered. "Margaret, Oh my goodness, it's been forever. How are you? I swallowed the lump in my throat. I'm better than I was. I was wondering if you'd like to meet for coffee sometime. Tomorrow, she said without hesitation. When we met at the little cafe downtown, the years fell away. We talked about old students, about books, about the small ways life had carried us forward. I didn't mention Daniel or Rachel at first, it felt too raw, but eventually the truth spilled out. Her eyes softened as she listened. You don't deserve that, Margaret. You gave so much. But maybe now it's time to give to yourself. Her words settled deep in me. For so long, I had defined myself by what I gave away. What if just once I let myself receive? From there, one meeting became another. Susan introduced me to other retired teachers. We formed a small circle gathering once a week at the library to swap stories, share articles, debate ideas. It felt like stepping back into the classroom, but this time I wasn't the one giving. I was among equals, laughing, thinking, feeling alive. At the community center, my book club became more than just Thursday discussions. Ellen invited me to her home for supper. Patricia insisted I join her church choir, even though my voice was shaky. I began to say yes. And with every yes, the walls of isolation crumbled. For the first time in years, I had friends who saw me for myself, not as Daniel's mother, not as Rachel's target, but as Margaret, the woman who still had stories, opinions, laughter, and dignity. Of course, word traveled. Family has a way of watching from the shadows. Cousin Mary mentioned offhandedly at church, I hear you've been busy these days. Rachel said you've really found a new crowd. There was a trace of surprise in her tone, maybe even envy. Yes, I said, simply smiling. I have. And it was the truth. I no longer lived on Rachel's timetable or Daniel's indifference. My calendar filled with lunches, walks, meetings. The silence of my house grew lighter, filled with music, laughter, and the scent of fresh flowers I bought for myself each week. One moment stays with me. At the community center during a reading group, a younger woman approached me after the session. She looked exhausted, with worry lines etched into her face. Mrs. Ellison, she said shyly, you speak with so much calm and strength. I'm struggling with my mother right now. Do you have any advice? For a moment, I was taken aback. Me advice? After all the rejection I had endured, but then I saw myself in her eyes, the younger woman desperate for guidance. So I told her gently, love your mother while you can, even when it's hard, because one day you'll wish you had. Her eyes filled with tears and she hugged me before leaving. As I stood there, I realized something important. My value hadn't disappeared with Daniel's neglect. I still had wisdom, compassion, experience. I still mattered. But independence didn't mean I was free of grief. There were nights I still lay awake, staring at the ceiling, aching for Daniel. Sometimes I caught myself reaching for the phone, but I didn't dial anymore. Instead, I pressed my hand against my chest and whispered, "You're okay, Margaret. You're okay." It wasn't the same as his voice, but it was enough to steady me. One evening, Ellen invited me to join a volunteer group at the local library. They needed people to read stories to children on Saturday mornings. The thought both thrilled and terrified me. Could I still connect with children the way I once did? That Saturday, I stood before a small group of wide-eyed kids, book in hand. My voice shook at first, but soon the rhythm of the words carried me. Their giggles, their gasps, their questions. It was like stepping back into a part of myself I thought was gone forever. When one little girl tugged at my sleeve afterward and said, "Will you read to us again next week?" my heart swelled. "Yes," I said softly. "I'd love to." Those small bonds grew into something bigger. By spring, my weeks were full. Tuesdays at the library, Thursdays at the book club, Saturdays volunteering, Sundays at church. Coffee dates with Susan, dinners with Ellen, walks with Patricia. I realized I no longer marked my days by Daniel's silence. I marked them by my own choices, my own joy. Rachel noticed, of course. She always noticed. At a family barbecue, she eyed me across the yard. "You've been busy," she said, her tone sharp under the false sweetness. "Yes," I replied calmly. "I have." Her smile faltered. She had expected the meek Margaret who begged for approval, who lingered on the edges, desperate for inclusion. But that Margaret was gone. I held my head high, chatting with cousins, playing with the children, laughing at stories. For once, Rachel wasn't the center of attention. I was. And I could see in her eyes she hated it. That night, as I walked home alone, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Victory. Small, quiet, but real. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. Later, sitting by the window with my journal, I wrote, "I have friends. I have community. I have strength. I am no longer invisible." I closed the book smiling to myself. The woman staring back at me in the glass was no longer the one who begged for calls that never came. She was someone else entirely. Someone stronger. Someone ready. Because soon it wouldn't just be about building my own life. It would be about telling the truth. And when I did, Daniel and Rachel's perfect image would never survive it. The family reunion was scheduled for late summer, a cousin's birthday, an excuse for everyone to gather in the backyard of an aunt's house with barbecue smoke curling through the warm evening air. I almost didn't go. For weeks, I turned the invitation over in my hands, wondering if it was worth it. Another room full of whispers, another stage where Rachel got to perform her role as the gracious wife while quietly erasing me. But then I thought of all the lies that had been told in my absence. Margaret's too tired. Margaret doesn't like company. Margaret's difficult. Lies whispered until they became truth in other people's minds. No. This time I would be there, and this time I would speak. The night of the gathering I dressed carefully. Not too showy, but deliberate. A soft blue blouse, a string of pearls, my hair brushed smooth. I wanted to look composed, not broken. When I arrived, I could feel the ripple of surprise. Heads turned. Someone murmured I didn't think she was coming. Rachel, standing near the grill, froze for half a second before pasting on a smile. "Margaret," she said, as though she were greeting a neighbor she barely knew. "You made it." "How wonderful." "Yes," I replied evenly. "I thought it was time." The evening began as it always did. Chatter, laughter, the clinking of glasses. I stayed quiet, at first watching, listening. Daniel avoided my eyes as though unsure of what version of me he would find tonight. My grandson darted past giggling, and for a moment I longed to grab him to hold him tight. But Rachel's gaze followed him like a hawk. Finally, after dinner, when the conversations lulled, I stood. My hands trembled, but my voice was steady. "Family," I began. "I want to say something." The chatter died. All eyes turned to me. For months now, I've been told stories have been spreading about me, that I'm too tired to attend gatherings, that I don't want company, that I'm difficult. I paused, letting the silence stretch. "I need you to know that those stories are not true." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Rachel shifted uncomfortably, her smile tightening. I drew a deep breath. "The truth is, I have been sick. I collapsed in my own home once, and when I called Daniel for help, Rachel told me not to bother them. Later, I collapsed again in public, and it was strangers who lifted me off the street. Strangers who called an ambulance. Not my son. Not my daughter-in-law. The silence that followed was absolute. Faces shifted, shock, disbelief, pity. I pressed on. And when you didn't see me at Christmas, at birthdays, at family dinners, it wasn't because I didn't want to come. It was because Rachel made sure I wasn't invited. She told you I was too tired, too unwilling. That was a lie." Gasps broke out this time. Cousin Mary's eyes widened. Aunt Clara covered her mouth. I could feel the heat of Rachel's glare burning into me, but I didn't stop. "I have lived in silence long enough," I said firmly. "I will not be erased. I will not be painted as something I am not. I was abandoned in my time of need, and I deserve for the truth to be known." Rachel sprang to her feet, then her voice sharp. "This is ridiculous. You're exaggerating, Margaret, as always. You've always been dramatic." "No," I cut her off, my voice slicing through hers. "I am not exaggerating. I am alive today, because strangers cared enough to help me when you did not. And Daniel," I turned to him, my eyes burning with tears, "you let it happen. You let her speak for you. You let her silence me." Daniel's face flushed, his mouth opening and closing like a man drowning. For once, he had no ready excuses. The family erupted in whispers. Some looked at Rachel with suspicion, others at Daniel with disappointment. The weight of their stares pressed down, and for the first time Rachel's mask slipped. Her smile vanished. Her eyes narrowed. "She's twisting the truth," Rachel hissed. "She's just bitter because she can't control you anymore, Daniel." But no one rushed to agree. The silence of the family spoke louder than her protest. I sat down slowly, my heart pounding but my shoulders light for the first time in years. I had said it. I had torn the truth from the shadows and laid it in the open. For a long moment no one moved. Then Aunt Clara reached across the table, placing her hand over mine. "Margaret," she said softly, "I had no idea." Her words cracked something inside me, not in pain, but in release. For so long I had been screaming into silence. Now finally someone had heard me. Rachel stormed off soon after, dragging Daniel with her. Their departure left a strange quiet, as though the air had been cleared after a storm. The relatives slowly began to speak again, but their eyes lingered on me differently now, not with pity, not with dismissal, but with respect. That night when I walked home, I felt taller, stronger. The evening air was cool, the stars scattered above me like small blessings. I whispered to the night sky, "You can't erase me anymore." And for the first time in years, I believed it. The weeks after the reunion were strange. For the first time in years, the silence in my house didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like freedom. I no longer sat waiting for Daniel's calls. I no longer measured my worth by whether Rachel allowed me into their home. I had spoken the truth, and in doing so, I had freed myself from the cage they built around me. Of course there was fallout. Daniel didn't call me for weeks. Rachel didn't speak to me at all. I heard through cousins that she was furious that she accused me of trying to ruin her family. But what she didn't understand was that the ruin had already happened the night she told me not to bother them. I had only unmasked it. What surprised me was the quiet support that trickled in. Cousin Mary stopped by with fresh apples. Aunt Clara called more often. Even Thomas, who once repeated Rachel's lies to me, apologized. "I should have asked you directly," he admitted over the phone. "I should have known better than to believe her." His words didn't erase the hurt, but they stitched something small and mending into the fabric of my heart. Meanwhile, I poured myself into the life I had rebuilt. The book club grew closer. My volunteer hours at the library became the highlight of my week. The children would run to me, clutching books, their eyes wide with anticipation. One little boy, perhaps 7, once asked, "Are you a grandma?" I smiled, though the answer ached. "Yes," I said softly. "I am." He grinned. "Then you can be our grandma here." And just like that, I realized something profound. Love doesn't only come from blood. Love can be chosen, shared, grown in places you least expect. My health, too, began to improve. The walks grew longer, my breath steadier. I cooked more meals for myself, meals that nourished me instead of filling silence. I found myself humming again little songs I hadn't thought of in years. It felt as though life had given me a second chance. Not the life I thought I wanted, clinging to a son who had drifted too far, but a new life, one that belonged entirely to me. One afternoon, as I sat journaling by the window, Daniel's name flashed on my phone. My hand hovered before I answered. "Mom," he said, his voice uncertain. "Can we talk?" There was a pause so long I could hear his breathing. Finally, he whispered, "I didn't know how bad it had gotten. I should have been there." I closed my eyes. The apology I had longed for. But it came too late. "Daniel," I said quietly, "you had chances. I called. I begged. And you weren't there. That is what I will remember." His voice cracked. "Can I make it up to you?" My heart twisted. A mother's love doesn't disappear no matter how deep the wound, but love doesn't erase reality either. "I don't know if you can," I said honestly. "I've built a life now, Daniel. One without waiting for your calls." There was silence on his end, then a faint, "I understand." After the call, I wept. Not because I regretted my words, but because they were true. The boy I had raised, the man I had loved beyond measure, had chosen to let me fall. And no apology could undo that. But my tears were different now. They weren't the tears of weakness, of invisibility. They were tears of acceptance. As autumn leaves began to scatter across the sidewalks, I realized I no longer feared the future. I no longer dreaded the days stretching out before me. I had a community. I had strength. I had myself. And that was enough. One evening, I walked through the park, the sunset spilling gold across the horizon. Children laughed in the distance. Couples strolled hand in hand. I walked alone, but for the first time alone didn't mean lonely. I stopped by the fountain and whispered to the rippling water. Rachel tried to erase me. Daniel let her. But I am still here. I am still me. The reflection that looked back at me wasn't invisible. It was strong, alive, and unbroken. So here I am telling you my story, not as a victim, but as a woman who took her life back after being told she was nothing. And I ask you now, have you ever been pushed aside by the very people you loved the most? Have you ever felt erased, invisible, discarded? If so, hear me when I say this: you are not invisible. You are not a burden. You can stand again even when those closest to you refuse to see you. My journey is not over. There are still days I ache for what was lost, still moments when I long for Daniel's laughter as a boy. But I do not live in that ache anymore. I live in the life I have reclaimed. And perhaps that is the sweetest revenge of all. Not anger, not bitterness, but joy. The joy of knowing I cannot be erased. Slowly, I fade out of this story, not as a woman broken on the kitchen floor, but as one who stood, who spoke, who lived again. If you've listened this far, I invite you, share your own story. Tell me if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever had to take your life back from those who tried to control it, and if you haven't already subscribed to Grace's Truth for more stories like mine. Because somewhere out there, another woman is whispering into the silence, waiting to be heard. And maybe your story or mine will be the voice that reminds her she is not alone.